Stop the world!
So if India were to push a firm security and perhaps even a defence agenda as part of that, and I think it should only be part. We're not talking about supplanting all of the other stuff that the Quad does. It's just that I think it had become a bit of a counterproductive ellipsis to say that we were doing everything except security when it was patently obvious that the four countries did have a common interest and that were sort of unnecessarily tiptoeing around the elephant in the room.
Welcome to Stop the World, the ASPI podcast on security and international affairs. I'm Olivia Nelson.
And I'm David Rowe.
Dave, it's great to be back after a nice long break filled with days at the beach and reading many books.
What have you read, Liv?
Many beach reads, I guess you could call them, but most relevant to this podcast would be War by Bob Woodward. It relates to the party. It was about the Biden administration primarily and to lead up to the war in Ukraine. And also a book called I Love Russia, which isn't what it sounds like, and I highly recommend.
Right, good. It's you've put me to shame. I read beach trash mostly. I did download Edmund Burke's Reflections on the French Revolution, which passes as political history, but I didn't read it. I felt better after downloading it about all the trash that I was reading. But anyway, while we've been away, there's been plenty going on.
Indeed. We've had the inauguration of Donald Trump and an avalanche of executive orders. There's the launch of China's DeepSeek AI model, which took a lot of people by surprise with how capable it is, at an apparent low cost in training and computing power. And looking ahead, in a few weeks, it will be 3 years since Russia's full invasion of Ukraine.
Yeah, and of course, President Trump has promised to end Russia's war on Ukraine in the first 100 days of his administration, so that's something to watch closely. We will, of course, aim to bring you, our beloved listeners, some meaty conversations on these big developments, as well as some that haven't made the headlines, but which are important nonetheless.
And today we've got a conversation with Raji, Pillai, Rajagopalan, Euan Graham, and Griffith University's Ian Hall on the Quad and security, including how the Quad is or isn't viewing deterrence.
I mean, we're looking at a situation in which China is rapidly modernizing its nuclear forces. We're going to be looking at around 1,000 Chinese weapons within a few years, up from 200. So they're changing that nuclear strategic balance pretty quickly. I think if the Quad's not talking about that and the implications of that, then I think it should be.
The trio also discusses the significance of the Quad foreign ministers meeting in Washington after President Trump's inauguration and what it signalled about the Quad's future evolution.
There's been a pattern established of good signalling after a change of government that these four are still going to carry on working together and collaborating. Beyond that, I think there's uncertainty. I don't think, not uncertainty in terms of whether the Quad will survive or not, but uncertainty about what the Quad's going to do.
That's enough from us, I think, Liv. We look forward to bringing you many more podcasts this year. Over to Raji.
Ian Hall and Euan Graham, welcome to the ASPI podcast, Stop the World. The world is being reshaped with war in Europe, upheaval in the Middle East, tensions in the South China Sea, as well as a new Trump administration in the United States. Alliances and partnerships are some of the great stabilizers in times of disruption. And today, I want to dive into one of those partnerships with you both, and that's a quadrilateral partnership between Australia, India, Japan, and the United States. It was originally formed in 2007 as the Quadrilateral Security Dialogue before Australia's withdrawal in 2008. But it made a comeback in 2017 during the first Trump administration, and since then, it has made major strides. So I want to start with a broad evaluation sort of a question. How would you both assess the effectiveness of the Quad to date? Has it lived up to its expectations, promises, and so on and so forth? Ian, I might start with you on that.
Thanks, Raji, and thanks for the invitation to come and talk about this. I think the Quad's done some things quite well, and then there are some other areas where we might be doing a little bit more, or we could certainly be a bit bolder in terms of the Quad. I think, just the basic thing in terms of signaling that these four countries are willing to work together, demonstrating that ability to work together in establishing a whole range of different, bureaucratic working groups to advance things, discussions on critical technology or cyber or infrastructure, all of these kinds of things. Those are all areas in which we needed to push back, we needed to challenge and compete with China better than we had been doing before. And those are areas in which the Quad, I think, has had an impact. It's also had an impact in kind of political terms too. If we think that the doomsayers about the Quad right at the beginning in 2017 was saying this was going to fuel some kind of arms race with China, or it was going to push Southeast Asia into the arms of Beijing and so on. It's not done that. I think there's a recognition in Southeast Asia that the Quad has done some positive things, and that the Quad partners can be worked with. So I think the Quad has achieved quite a lot. And one last thing that I should mention that I think is really important is that it's had an impact on the bilateral relationships between these countries too. And that's especially true in terms of Australia and India, where we see that pre-Quad, these countries wanted to work together but weren't always sure how to do it and how much attention to pay each other, what sort of areas in which they might have overlapping interests and so on. The Quad's done a really good job at helping those two countries to identify all of those areas, and then to allow those countries then to build up that bilateral relationship, which has really gone from strength to strength over the last 7 or 8 years or so.
Absolutely. Thanks, Ian. I think each of the bilateral, trilateral partnerships have strengthened so much that it actually cumulatively worked in favor of the Quad. But I'm keen to hear Euan's thoughts on the effectiveness of the Quad and how Quad has come about in a sense.
Thanks, Raji. I think one thing to stress is the relationship between the concept of the Indo-Pacific and the Quad. The Indo-Pacific, as the name suggests, it hints at the two-ocean formulation for the mega region, the Indian Ocean and the Pacific. To what extent are these two halves interconnected? That's really at the heart of the purpose and the critique and the functionality of the Quad. And the Indo part is largely associated with India. I mean, there's a sort of natural geographic anchoring to the four Quad partners: India in the west of the Indo-Pacific, Australia in the south, Japan in the north, and the United States at the other side of the Pacific, and with its own Pacific territories, and of course all of its forward deployed forces in the Western Pacific. So the geostrategic logic is quite clear, but the fortunes of the Quad have fluctuated. I think that's really beyond controversy. As you stated in your opening, the fact that the Quad went into recess for effectively a decade shows how hit and miss that has been. In some ways, you could say that the Quad kind of appeared too early. The glue, the necessary common threat perceptions and common interests have certainly coalesced since then. And that's often thought of most in terms of India's journey, but not only India's too. I think Japan, Australia have also accelerated their own threat perceptions. And I think that is the undergirding logic. It is about balance, and China is the biggest upset to that balance. But at the same time, in the current context, where we have a United States that is, in some senses, revisionist in its outlook, explicitly under President Trump, revisiting its alliance commitments and global position, then the Quad could be said to be very useful for making sure that there is an anchoring framework within the Indo-Pacific that maintains US interests and an active role. And I think that really that's where the rub currently lies.
Terrific. Yeah, absolutely. The threats and challenges that brought back the Quad is very, very clear because those threats had intensified so much in that one decade's time. Now, let's look at the Trump administration in the White House. The return of Trump to the White House, Secretary of State Marco Rubio has taken charge, and he did convening of the Quad foreign ministers on day 2 of the new administration. Where do you see both looking at the Quad going forward in terms of in the next couple of years while they are in administration, and kind of forward moment for the Quad? Euan, can I start with you there?
Well, at the moment, we're very early in the Trump administration, and the predictable unpredictability is that President Trump's instinct seems to be largely sort of hemispheric in scope, hence the interest in Canada, Mexico, Greenland, and then the wild card just in the last few days of the Gaza initiative. Asia has actually been mercifully bypassed in some of this quite early confusion in the Trump administration. So I think it's particularly helpful that, as you've said, one of the very first acts of the new Secretary of State in Washington at the inauguration was to attend the Quad. That was an imprimatur of the new administration that it valued the Quad and it intends to persist with it. And there was a very short but punchy statement that was put out by the four foreign ministers, which I think made a pretty clear agenda that this is about pushing back against coercion, within which I think China will certainly be read, or even though it wasn't named. And the big shift from the Biden administration is that the Quad is now an explicit security partnership in all domains. Previously, the Quad had stayed out of calling itself a security partnership, which was rather awkward given that it was still dealing with security in some non-traditional areas like health and cyber security and maritime. But now I think that fig leaf has dropped, and we can read into that, I think, the higher comfort level of India, Japan and Australia in not feeling that they have to tiptoe around the use of the word security partnership. I think behind that, a lot of it was a sense of unease that the Quad was not accepted in Southeast Asia. But as Euan said, I think the pattern in ASEAN is that it takes a time for something to bed in. There's an initial pushback and often a questioning of new initiatives, and the Quad was not alone in that. But I think now some of the messaging from the key ASEAN capitals has changed to value the Quad as a proposition that doesn't have to be seen in zero-sum terms alongside ASEAN's still important diplomatic tethering role.
Euan, what are your thoughts on Quad going forward, in a sense, in the next few years?
Yeah, so look, I mean, I agree with you, and I think that the meeting of the foreign ministers after Trump's inauguration, or around the time of Trump's inauguration, was a really positive sign. It's actually, and it was a positive sign too, because there's been a bit of a pattern of this after, we saw this after the Australian election. There was a meeting in Tokyo of leaders at that point. So there's been a pattern established, a good signalling after a change of government, that these four are still going to carry on working together and collaborating. Beyond that, I think there's uncertainty. I don't think, not uncertainty in terms of whether the Quad will survive or not, but uncertainty about what the Quad's going to do, and that's generated principally by the Trump administration. So it is very difficult to read the tea leaves on this one. I think if we look across the cabinet picks, we've got a number of China hawks and China skeptics in DC, and I think that we've already seen signs that they will push for the Quad to be more focused on security issues. I think the other thing that we haven't quite seen yet is what we might lose from the Quad. There are working groups, leader-led working groups on things like climate and health, for example. It's very difficult to see how they can survive in their current form, given the kind of agenda that is being advanced now by the Trump administration. So the Biden-led initiative on cancer that was announced last year in the Leaders Summit, again, I think there's got to be a question mark over that. So what we might see in an ideal world is a more focused Quad, but there's just too much uncertainty in DC at the moment to be able to make really confident predictions about where we're going to go.
Thanks. But speaking about way forward, I was also kind of if either of you have seen any update on the Quad Coast Guard training that was scheduled to be held in January, but I haven't seen anything by way of media reports or statements on it. So I wonder if either of you have seen anything on it, actually.
Nothing on top of what you said, Raji. I mean, it was an interesting expansion of the Quad, also the location that, in fact, I think was going to be hosted in the Western Pacific by Japan. It builds on the logic of some of the other Coast Guard initiatives that have already been in play within the Quad, which has a strong maritime focus for obvious reasons. I think that maybe that could be a casualty of some of the initial uncertainty about what the concrete agenda is. I think the broad lines are quite firm in that joint statement. I wouldn't worry too much about it either. I think the Coast Guard initiative it fills a gap, but it's not core to the existence of the Quad itself. So long as there's something that takes its place, whether that's naval cooperation or building on the existing maritime domain awareness initiatives. But that certainly will have to be addressed sooner rather than later.
Okay, great. So both of you touched upon the security aspects of the Quad, or the lack of it in a sense. So I want to look at that a bit more. Since its revival in 2017, there has been a reluctance to talk about the security aspects of the Quad partnership, at least in open terms. Instead, the Quad partners have tended to highlight the focus on regional development, prosperity, things like cooperation on health, climate change, humanitarian assistance, and even with some mentions of maybe maritime and cybersecurity from time to time. But the statement from the foreign ministers meeting a couple of weeks ago, like you said, emphasized security in all domains. So, Euan, let me start with you. Is this a significant shift that you're seeing? And do you see potential for a more security focus of the Quad going forward? Clearly, there was no China mentioned, but the fact that it was a short, sharp press statement with a heavy multiple reference to Quad security was something that was positive in my view. But I would be keen to hear both of your thoughts. So let me start with Euan first.
Yes, I think it was indicative of the trend line, and it answered the immediate question over whether the US would continue its attachment to the Quad. It's sometimes forgotten that the revival happened under the first Trump administration, so I think in that sense there's no issue about it being a legacy from Biden, as with some other US initiatives. I think all eyes are next on the Leaders Summit, which Delhi will be convening later this year. That will take things to the next level. Whether President Trump attends or not, I think he certainly has to if the Quad is seen to maintain its momentum. But that passes the agenda in no small part to India. And I think that would there's a glass half full and half empty side to that. I think the main line of critique of the Quad is that India is somehow the weakest link, the partner that is less committed than the others. So if India were to push a firm security and perhaps even a defense agenda as part of that, and I think it should only be part. We're not talking about supplanting all of the other stuff that the Quad does. It's just that I think it had become a bit of a counterproductive ellipsis to say that we were doing everything except security when it was patently obvious that the four countries did have a common interest and that were sort of unnecessarily tiptoeing around the elephant in the room.
Euan, what are your thoughts on in terms of the security aspects of the Quad?
Yeah, so I should probably just kind of put my hand up here and say, a year or so ago, I did another podcast with ASPI with Justin Bassey, and Justin asked me about this, and I said at the time, look, I'm kind of happy with the Quad doing non-security things or doing soft security things because the other aspects, harder security issues are being dealt with in the bilateral alliances or partnerships and things like AUKUS and so on. I've now come around to a different view, I think, largely because the Trump administration is now in power. And I think in order to sustain the Quad, a harder, stronger focus on hard security issues is necessary. I just can't see the Quad carrying on with some of the initiatives, as I've already said, that are, if you like, softer. So, and I think if we think that the Quad is a useful mechanism, and I think it does, I think it's got to have a harder edge to it. And I think that now is the time for that edge to emerge. I also agree with Euan that it's going to be up to India to set this agenda this year, almost by accident. India was supposed to host the Leaders Summit in 2024. It wasn't able to do that. So now it's in the hot seat in 2025. And it's going to be up to New Delhi to set some priorities for the Quad. So I'm going to be watching very carefully to see what kinds of conversations go on next week when Narendra Modi goes to Washington, meets Donald Trump, what kinds of things get discussed and get put out in the media there. I'm assuming an invitation to come to Delhi for a Quad summit is going to be issued at that point. I'm assuming too that Trump will want to go. After all, in the first Trump administration, he was very well received in India. He was put in front of large numbers of people. He seemed to enjoy the experience. And so I would imagine that he would be keen to go to India again. So India is in an interesting position now. And probably the one last thing to say about that is that the India-US relationship in the last year or so, the last 18 months or so, has not been quite as good as it probably could be and has been in the past. And so there's a chance for India to reset that, to forge the way forward. But they're going to do that in a really uncertain context. So this is going to be pretty fascinating to see what evolves over the next few months.
Yeah, absolutely. In fact, I think that was precisely the question that I had for you, because you have been a long time India expert. So I was kind of keen to see if you were going to look for an India that is going to look for a lot more punchier Quad that is going to take a pretty strong stand on China, for instance, and how it. But in terms of the bilateral relationship, you're absolutely right. The US-India relationship has gone through a bit of a rough patch in the last 18 months or so. But I just watched the External Affairs Minister, Dr. Jaishankar's visit to the US, and post that he did a press conference with the Indian ambassador to the US, and he was very, very positive about the relationship and the kind of trust he talked about and the congruence of interest and the alignment that he increasingly sees with the US. He does see both for the Quad, but also on the bilateral level, he sees quite a strong momentum going forward. But I think India's own positioning on the Quad, I think it's how strong a stand, since I also look at India to kind of put it very sum up, I think it depends on the relationship with China at the end of the day. And the fact that the Galwan conflict between the two sides, the border conflict between India and China that started in 2020 summer, has not completely been resolved. The disengagement process has started in some sectors, but it's not been satisfactorily executed in many other sectors. So there is still an ongoing problem between India and China on the border. And the fact that it has taken 5 years to get to wherever we are, even at this stage, shows the kind of rigidity on both sides and some level in the inflexibility and the challenging nature of India-China relationship. There was a border patrol management sort of an agreement that was done a few months ago, but I don't believe that is still changing the overall tone and tenor of the India-China relationship. And given the difficulties that I see in that relationship, I think India is much more today open and keener to sort of engage with all of its new security partners, US, Australia, Japan, France, and so on and so forth. And of course, with the other minilaterals, and of which the Quad is one of the most significant ones in a sense. So I would see a much stronger push for security agenda in the Quad coming from India. And I think, again, like you said, it's difficult to predict, but I think India has an opportunity to showcase that agenda in the upcoming Quad Summit when it hosts later in the year, in a sense. Staying on the security for a moment, I'm also keen to get both of your thoughts on what the ultimate security outcome ought to be. Deterring China, dealing with China is obvious goal in a sense, but how exactly should the Quad go about doing that? Given that there are two nuclear powers among the Quad countries, Quad members, what role can it play in nuclear deterrence? If either of you, maybe I'll start off with Euan first.
Thanks, Raji. I think this again comes back to the usefulness of the Indo-Pacific as a strategic framework. We can certainly buy into the logic at a superficial level, but I think there are genuine questions to be asked about how four countries so far apart in their geography can actually provide support to each other in a crisis. The United States is the standout because of its capabilities. I suppose that gives extra impetus to India's role as a nuclear power, so that it brings in that element in an unusual way, because none of the other Pacific allies have a nuclear capability. They all depend on extended nuclear deterrence. But I think China is well placed to play that game in some ways. That your reference, not in a nuclear dimension, but to the continuing instability on the border. India has worked hard to try and bring that back to a status quo that it can live with, despite the loss of some territory in 2020. But I think it's certainly a probability, if not a certainty, that China will see a relationship between the pressure that it is able to put India under from all dimensions across the land border and in the nuclear domain, as a way of making life difficult in the maritime domain, which is really where the Quad's emphasis lies. We do see, for example, some hard decisions already coming to bear in India, that the reported decision not to proceed with a third aircraft carrier and instead to press ahead with the nuclear propelled submarine program shows that those resource decisions are coming to bite, and that is partly in the context of the fact that India has this constant pressure from China across the disputed frontier. That puts it in a slightly more vulnerable category to the other three Quad members. But the Indian Ocean is important to China, and I think the ultimate validation of the Quad's strategic relevance is the fact that China continues to be worried about it and to criticize the formation of what it calls, bloc mentality. It realizes that I think India, when it fulfills its strategic potential, can make life very difficult, and that's only going to get harder in the long term for China. So I think the emphasis fits in with what is evident from China's attempt to engage in a sort of tactical mending of relations with many of the US allies. And in that reading, India is not alone. Japan, with a weak government, is currently mending its own fences. Australia has put great emphasis on the economic relationship and under what they call the stabilisation policy since the Labour government came in. And across the board, we actually see many US allies, the UK, the European Union now also talking about increasing its economic links with China. I think that poses interesting questions about where Australia and Japan will go in this.
Hey, fantastic. Euan, your thoughts on this?
So the nuclear dimension is a really interesting one because it's not been discussed in a Quad context, to my knowledge, and it may well have been discussed within Quad meetings, but behind closed doors. I think it's incredibly important. We're looking at a situation in which China is rapidly modernizing its nuclear forces. We're going to be looking at around 1,000 Chinese weapons within a few years, up from 200. So it's a pretty significant change. We've got China working on a whole range of new delivery systems as well. So they're changing that nuclear strategic balance pretty quickly. I think if the Quad's not talking about that and the implications of that, then, I think it should be, clearly. And I think we also need to be thinking, we've tended to neglect questions about nuclear deterrence for the last 30 years or so. But, B, the other issue here is that these are no longer the dyadic relationships. It's not just China-US, it's also China and India. It's also China and Japan. There's a question about Taiwan. And one of the big criticisms that's put about trying to limit what China's trying to do or push back on what China's trying to do is that there's this view that suddenly that would escalate into a major nuclear exchange should there be any kind of conflict in the Taiwan Strait. We've got to talk about these things, I think, more sensibly and more overtly and more systematically. And I don't see any reason why the Quad shouldn't be a place in which those conversations should take place. And after those conversations, then I think we can think about how we might want to restructure what we're doing in the region, given that we're already into an ongoing and rolling conversation about where various military assets should be, how they should be used, and so on and so forth across the Indo-Pacific.
Terrific. And in a bit of self-publicity, I'm going to say that I just had a longish USIP, US Institute of Peace report in from DC, looking at Indian perceptions of China's nuclear expansion based on interviews with senior retired Indian officials and analysts, because I think this is a topic that has not really gained the kind of attention because everybody has been so lost in Russia, and Russia's talk about rhetoric about tactical nuclear weapons and kind of thing. Meanwhile, China's nuclear expansion and modernization has continued at an alarming pace. And I think an arsenal around 1,000 warheads or 1,500 and so on and so forth, that could actually pose significant pressures on other countries, including India. And that again, so China's nuclear developments will have several spin off effects, and therefore we need to have this in mind in a sense. Let me come to another question on the many countries are, of course, looking at and trying to navigate the unpredictability around President Trump. So, does the Quad present an opportunity for Australia, India, and Japan to engage with the Trump administration as a collective in the interest of its shared policy challenges? And I would think actually all the three countries are actually shouldering a lot of the security and other sort of burden in a sense, a lot more responsibility. So it should be welcoming to the Trump administration. But I'm keen to hear your thoughts. Let me start with you, Ian.
So yes, I think the fact, and Euan's mentioned this already, that Trump, the Quad, the revival of the Quad in 2017 happened under the Trump administration. It's a Trump administration initiative. I think is a good thing. I think that allows, it's a conversation starter at least with the president today. But I do think we need to establish a kind of a clear message about what the Quad is adding and what these countries are adding as well in terms of assisting the United States and advancing US national interests in the region and advancing the broader security of the region, as well as advancing the interest and security of the countries concerned. We've got to be very clear about that. So we often talk about, sometimes the conversation about the Quad is how do we better market this to our own populations. But now I think the big challenge is how do we best market this to Washington. I think people like Marco Rubio understand what the Quad does and why it matters, but we're going to have to very clearly establish a one-sentence message about what the Quad does and why it matters for President Trump. And here I think, competing effectively with China is really the purpose of the Quad. And then from that kind of redefined mission statement, if you like, from that point, we then need to come up with a refined and pared down agenda that is not as broad-based as it has been over the last few years, where the Quad has kind of sprawled into a whole bunch of other areas, all of mutual concern, and they're all important, but they're things that we could do outside the Quad just as effectively, arguably, as inside the Quad. So now it's going to be about sharpening the message, selling the product. There may also be some, that might cost us too. So, it's possible that the Trump administration comes back and says, hey, Australia, hey, Japan, you're spending way less than 2% of GDP on defense. India's defense budget, again, this year, underwhelming, again, less than 2%. We may need to step up in those areas. And so there may be a cost to this too.
Great. Euan, your thoughts on this?
Well, let's go back to first principles. I mean, the Quad is one of a so-called minilateral. There's a lot of attention to minilaterals as having the momentum in the security arena, including trilaterals between US allies. Why do we need that? Well, the big difference between this region and Europe is there is no collective treaty organization like NATO. You have important allies, but no cross-bracing framework in which they collectively meet and determine their common concerns and interests. That's as much in the United States' interest as it is in the Allies, for the very basic reason that China is too big and too powerful a challenge and potential future adversary for the United States to counterbalance alone. And equally, from the Allies' perspective, even in aggregate, Japan, India, and Australia are not going to be up to that challenge either. They can only really do this by aggregating their collective heft. And that really is the bottom line rationale for the Quad, that those four countries could, if they get their act together, and maintain cooperation, secure their own supply base, and add to collective deterrence in the military realm, do something to change China's calculations. So I think that's the way to pose it to Washington. I think many within the US system get that. I think that the interest in India is in precisely as a long-term proposition for a country that can eventually provide a countervailing balance to China within the Asian and Eurasian continent. So I think that logic is there. It just has to be clearly communicated. And part of the problem is it's been lost in all of the other stuff to try and make the Quad look as unwarlike and not like a constraining function. I think that has led to the sort of rather confused question, which people are entitled to ask. Well, what's this for? Is it about healthcare, common standards, infrastructure, or what's the underpinning logic? And I think balance really is what it ultimately comes down to. But that can be used, I think, effectively to sell the need for a broader coalition in the US interests.
Okay, fantastic. And I think we are nearing the end, but I got one final question for each of you. So if you could put one item or one policy idea on the agenda for the next Quad leaders meeting, what would it be? Euan?
So it really puts us all on the spot on this one. Let me just chuck something in here that I don't think has been discussed very much, but I think is important. So we talk a lot about maritime security. What about aviation security? What about security of the skies? Again, we talk about security. We've talked about overflight in the South China Sea, but I don't think I've seen a lot of initiatives related to overflight. We've got huge problems in this area. So GPS spoofing has become a massive problem for airlines, for airliners that are flying all around the world. And this has emerged in our region too. It's on the India-Pakistan border. It's in Myanmar. We've seen cases in Japan, in Hong Kong recently as well. And we've also seen, of course, lots of rather unpleasant confrontations between Chinese aircraft and American, Australian, Japanese, and so on aircraft in the region as well. I think it's probably time for a conversation about how the Quad looks at this and how it might cooperate to put in place some stronger frameworks and to push a conversation about aviation security across the Indo-Pacific.
Terrific. I love that idea. And I think it's time that we put in place some sort of a norms or some rules of the road and all of that. I love it. I'm keen to hear Euan's thoughts now.
Well, I'll pinch one from Ian, which is on the nuclear side, and you emphasise this too, Raji, and I would just second the excellence of your report. I would please go out and read Raji's report. It's very informative. But aside from the need to start the nuclear dynamic conversation within the Quad, I'd go back to economic security. If supply chain resilience is an important part of what the Quad does, how is that actually going to be incentivized amongst the four countries? One obvious way to do that without approaching it as a free trade area is to talk about providing concessional rates at which to sell those key infrastructure components to each other. That's going to be very ambitious in the current protectionist mold of the US foreign policy. But let's flip that around and say, well, Trump wants to be the deal maker. He likes to bring tariffs into play. Let's not be totally scared of that. Let's not wait for that sword of Damocles to fall. Maybe the more sensible, smarter way around it is to offer some of those, concessional free trade type arrangements It's not going to evolve to the level of AUKUS. I think that's a level of ambition that will probably never be fulfilled within the Quad. But AUKUS is sometimes talked about as a free trade agreement at a highly strategic level. And I think that same logic could be adapted to the Quad, maybe at a lower bar, but to start talking about how India in particular can be brought in to some of the concessional rates, because India lies outside of almost all of the current free trade agreements in the area, particularly RCEP and the CPTPP.
Terrific. No, I really love both of the ideas, economic security and the supply chain resilience. And I think this is, again, a topic for another podcast, because I think there has been the supply chain resilience has been talked about in so many different trilateral partnerships and kind of thing. And some of them haven't gone very far, very much in terms of making progress. So we should have another conversation around that. But I love the aviation security and the supply chain resilience that needs to be a part of the core agenda for the Quad in the coming agenda. I think those are great points. Hopefully, our Quad leaders and the leadership, the ministries are listening to these conversations as well and taking cue from here. Today, let me thank you both of you for joining this podcast, Quad Pod, so to say. But it's been a fun conversation and a very informative conversation. Thank you so much for joining us today.
That's all we have time for today, folks. Thanks for listening. We'll be back with another episode next week.